All right. Well, hey, everybody tuning in. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sean Bublitz. I'm one of the ministry consultants here at the Unstuck Group. And just want to say thank you so much for participating in the research project that we just recently partnered with Blockbot in. You should have already received the report with all of the data in it. We hope that you've just enjoyed looking through that, reading through that. And today we just wanted to take a few minutes and kind of expound on some of the data that we found there and hopefully bring you some insights from what we're learning as we work on the ground with churches and what exactly that data means for our churches across the country. So we're going to take the first about 20 minutes of our time here together, dig into a few specific areas. First of all, groups and volunteer engagement. We want to look at giving and social media as well. And then we're going to leave the last 10 minutes or so for Q&A. If there are any questions out there, we'll take those. If not, we'll wrap up our time. So whether you're joining us live right now or you're watching this at a different time, just again, thank you for being part of this survey with us. I'm joined today by my good friend, Amy Anderson, who's the Director of Consulting here at the Unstuck Group. Hi, Amy. Will you give us just a little background on you?
Sure. I'm with the Unstuck Group. Sorry, I just had some help stop by. My computer wasn't working before, but we're all good now. Thank you. Yeah, with the Unstuck Group, I work with churches each and every week with the Unstuck team and also lead our team, I guess, in some regards. But I spent 12, 13 years at a church in Minnesota on the executive team leading the weekend. And now it's really an honor to work with churches across the country each and every week.
Awesome. So as we walk through this data together, any of you who are listening right now, if you have questions that come up along the way, you could submit those in real time in the chat function on Zoom. Tiffany from our team is going to be answering some of those and then helping us just kind of pull out some questions that Amy and I will get to and address at the end of the webinar. So let's start off, Amy, with some thoughts about the metrics in the report that dealt specifically with how well we're engaging people on site at the church. So the data told us that 74% of growing churches had increases in first-time guests compared to only 23% of declining churches. So could you just talk a little bit about the importance of monitoring and interpreting that guest to attendance ratio?
Sure. And if you listen to our podcast at all, we actually just recently talked about this, but maybe I would just start with it. It's really important to actually measure our first-time guests and how many people we have coming to our church. And the reason for that is that I think sometimes when we have a decline or we're not seeing the growth we want, churches will often lean towards thinking we've got this backdoor problem, meaning we're not connecting with people who are here, they're leaving our church, when really what we find a lot of the time with the churches we work with is that it's actually a front door problem. We're not actually getting enough people through the doors to our churches. And the numbers that we've been working with is that from the research we saw is that about 15%, you're going to experience 15% attrition over the course of a year at your church, meaning people will be leaving because they leave, because they move, because
somebody passes away, maybe.
Someone passes away, right? Yeah. And so to be growing, you've got what we recommend with churches that you need to get at least the number of people of your average weekly attendance through the doors over the course of a year, because not everyone comes back, right? And then we would hope that at best case scenario, you've got about 20% of the people that actually would stay. And so I don't do the math around here, Tony does, but if you're achieving that 20% retention rate, it would say that if you're like a church of 500 people, you would need to have 500 new people over the course of a year just to kind of maintain or have a level of growth at your church if you look at it against those attrition numbers. So all that to say, if you are a growing church, I think what the data said is that they've got increases in these first-time guests. And so a real practical next step or takeaway with this would be, if you aren't counting that, start counting that. And then remember, those numbers are pretty high. We need to have that average attendance through the door over the course of a year in order to actually have a healthy front door.
Yeah, that's really good. You know, there are a couple of churches that I've worked with just in the last couple of years. One that came in and their guest to attendance ratio is really anemic. I mean, very low. They felt like maybe they were doing okay, but they had about 0.4 guests for every one attender. They got
Yep.
really focused on that over the course of the next year. And
Yeah.
they actually saw a 2% decline in attendance turn into 3.5% growth in attendance over the course of the year, really
Oh,
by
wow.
focusing on number, which is that's a huge shift in a church that's going from a decline to some growth. Another
That's
church,
right.
another church had no idea what their guest to attendance ratio was. They started tracking it, got really focused on it, found out the second year into it that they had 1.5 guests for every one attender, which is fantastic.
Wow.
They had grown by 14% that year, just by getting really focused on that number and how we are helping the people in our church, invite and bring guests with them. So yeah, very
Well,
important. Thanks, Amy.
I think sometimes churches wonder too, how do we actually track first time guests? I mean, let's be honest, people filling out connection cards, it's a strategy, but it's not one that a lot of churches find success with. They know they have so many more first time guests than what they're seeing what they're seeing in names and people filling out cards. So you have to get kind of creative. And I don't know, Sean, if you've seen some various ways, but we always recommend, if you've got great spaces for people to, be greeted when they come in, new here, you can find some creative ways to measure that. Of course, through all the kids numbers. I think the key is to get a baseline of how many first time guests you're seeing now, the ones that you can count, and keep looking for ways to make sure you've got that healthy front door with more people coming through. So measuring will give you some indication of that.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think information is not free anymore. And when you ask for someone's information, they expect something in return, and they're not going to give it away for nothing. And so
right.
One creative thing I've seen some churches doing is they actually commit to give to some local charity or philanthropic organization in your name if you just give some of your information to them, and who doesn't want to help in that way. So I think that's a creative idea, good way to get that at that. Okay, so here's another telling metric, Amy. Okay. 22% of declining churches had increases in children's ministry, while 77% of growing churches saw increases in their children's ministry. So 22% of declining had an increase, but 77% of growing churches had an increase in their children's ministry. What do you think that means?
Yeah, well, obviously the growing churches, it indicates that they're actually reaching younger families. And the work that we did through Vital Signs, as we did an analysis in one of our quarterly reports, showed the same thing, that growing churches have a healthy percentage of kids in their church, whereas declining churches have a higher percentage of students. And it's just that, we're getting older, we're aging. When you've got young kids, it indicates that you've got parents who are actually coming to church.
Yeah.
Right? Kids don't bring their parents to church
right.
by and large.
Right.
Parents come to church, and it must be compelling, that they've got their students in there with them and they're checking their kids into programming. So for me, it's an indication, not so much around what is offered in kids ministries as it is an indication of what's happening in that main weekend service.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very good.
Is it relevant to those younger families, the parents of them?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things we always try to do is what's a practical next step with that? And so I don't know, with the churches that gave us this information, maybe you are in the growing church, maybe you're in the declining, but if you've got low children's numbers, I think a practical next step would be to do a level of evaluation on your weekend service. Sometimes we habituate to our environments and we just can't see it the way new people will see it. But I always challenge church leaders, invite someone new to your church and then go to church with them and see it through their eyes, see it through a young family, young parents' eyes, and have your team actually maybe do that as well. Obviously, we should all be inviting when we're on the leadership team at a church, but it's amazing how quickly it's easy to drift away from that. But take a look at that weekend service and evaluate, boy, if I was in my 30s and I had a couple kids and I had to get them all ready and get them to church, give you an hour, did that hour do anything in my life? Did I learn anything? Did I experience a level of transformation? And so I think if you've got low numbers, that's a great place to start looking to say, are we drawing them?
Yeah. I think a lot of churches too are curious about what a healthy number would be for them as far as their kids' percentage of total attendance. And I think the best rule of thumb is just to look around at the community around you and get a sense of, of those 0 to 5th graders in the community, 15-minute drive time around your church. what
Yep.
percentage of that demographic there makes up your community. And if your
Yep.
church resembles that, then you're probably in a pretty healthy place. If it's
Right.
a little greater than that, you're probably doing a great job of reaching young families. But if it's less,
Mm-hmm.
there's probably some work to do.
That's right. Yeah. Hey, Sean, one of the numbers, one of the metrics that I thought was interesting was around volunteer engagement. And I think it was just a little surprising. It said moderate volunteer engagement, obviously, is a sign of growth, but 34% of declining churches indicated that more than half of their attenders are volunteering at least once a month, and only 19% of growing churches had that high level of engagement. Talk to me about kind of that juxtaposed with numbers.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. It seems counterintuitive, and there are several numbers that we run in our vital signs that it seems like they're telling us one thing, but we've got to kind of look at it differently. So growing churches, we just talked about, see a large number of new guests as part of their church. And what do those new people not do? They don't serve yet, right? They don't give, they don't do the group yet. That's what they're not doing. And so that actually pushes that percentage of overall, your volunteer overall percentage to your attendance down. So a lot of times in those growing churches, we do see a little bit lower percentage. In declining churches, often what's happened is all of our newer people have left, all of our guests, there aren't guests showing up. And so it's just kind of declined to the place where it's just us serving. I mean, we're just all here together. We're all serving. So, you know, we could see 80-90% of the church who's engaged in serving somehow. So if your church is growing, but your volunteer percentage, your volunteer engagement looks lower, it's likely that you're feeling discouraged. But, you know, healthy growing churches often see 40 to 50% of their attendees serving. And that's a really healthy number. So, you know, 80%, 90% is not actually a good sign. I think just practically, you've got to continue to call those new people to take a step. And I think a lot of people's first step is going to be on a serving team. We're seeing that in a lot of churches. It may have been that, you know, small groups was previously the first step a lot of people would take, but now I think it's, you know, onto a serving team, whatever those easy on-ramps are, whether it's a greeter or, you know, playing bass on the weekend or whatever it might be.
Yep. Interesting. One of the trends that Tony and I have talked about is they're actually more willing to give before they're willing to serve.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
That time factor is such a big challenge for people these days.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So let's switch gears to some of the measures of engagement that are not as directly tied to the weekend services. So one of the things that stood out to me was the difference in social media engagement between growing and declining churches. So Facebook is increasing for both growing and declining churches, but Instagram is where there was a big separation. 44% of declining churches said they're using Instagram, but 72% of growing churches were. What are your thoughts on that, Amy?
Yeah, well, first, I would actually just kudos that it tells me that both declining and growing churches are trying some new things.
Yeah.
To see that 44% were engaged, you know, with Instagram. Obviously, Facebook has been the go-to for a long time. And by the way, I wouldn't write it off. Now, Instagram obviously is attracting a younger demographic. That's where those people are hanging out and doing things. But I was talking to Kim Meyer about this. She's the author and founder of Less Chaos, Less Noise, a big communications guru. And I thought what she shared was insightful on this. So churches use Instagram, for example, but it drives her crazy. I think, sorry to say that, with how they use it. And I love how she said it. She goes, these social media platforms really need to have a job description because they serve the church in different ways. And so, for instance, Facebook, what Kim would say is that's a place to, you can communicate about events, you can share, various things. It's really an interactive piece to, you can invite people to church that way. It's just very high connection.
Right.
But Instagram, on the other hand, it's hard to share things on Instagram. And it's really more about the human factor. It's the stories. It's highly visual. If you're just taking the things you're doing on Facebook and then putting those on Instagram, you're missing the mark. It's not going to be a helpful tool for you. You have to think through for instance, you don't shop at Target or something like that because they're showing pictures of the Target building on Instagram, right? That's not the purpose of Instagram. And so I would just say with those numbers, I think we need to be in those spaces as churches. Growing churches, you can see over 70% are engaged there. You just have to take a few steps back, I think, and think, why are we using that platform? Invite some of the people who use it so that you know how to use it well. If you aren't clear on that, growing or declining churches, I think you need to pause and kind of relaunch it and kind of recognize the difference between those different media. But I think the takeaway is social media, that's where the generation is living. That's where they spend a lot of time. I mean, so much has changed in the last 5-10 years in this space, and you need to have a presence, but you need to have the right kind of presence.
Yeah, that's really good. One other thing that I wondered about looking at that data was whether that just spoke to the risks that growing churches are willing to take. Instagram is it's still uncharted territory for some churches. And it seems like those growing churches are willing to just kind of dive in and figure it out as they go. And so I wonder if there's just kind of the spirit of innovation behind that too.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, Sean, a question for you. Almost half of the churches surveyed, they didn't have Sunday school at all. But the small group engagement numbers jumped out at me. Small group participation increased in 74% of growing churches and only 33% of declining churches. How would you interpret that?
Yeah, so again, this backs up the data that we continue to see about Sunday school. I love just kind of summarizing what Tony said about this before. Can a church grow with Sunday school as their primary engagement point when it comes to relationships? Yes, but it seems like the odds are significantly stacked against you right now. Only 14% of Sunday school churches saw an increase in that engagement, while 53% of small group churches saw an increase.
Wow.
And so I think what the data is telling us, and it's pretty obvious, is that Sunday school just isn't as an effective strategy to get people engaged as it used to be. And we can see in the data too that many churches are moving away from Sunday school. So think about this, the data in the context of just your discipleship pathway. How are you encouraging spiritual movement in people? How do you want to help them grow spiritually? Often, things that we see when we lead churches through this exercise of identifying their discipleship pathway is it's relationships, it's spiritual practices, it's serving, it's hearing, teaching, those kinds of things. There really are just a small handful of things that God has created as catalysts in us to create spiritual movement. And so what is in your church? What's the environment that maximizes that movement? That relational connection is often what we're talking about when you talk small groups. And Sunday school seems to be more of the teaching and less of the relationship. So I think what we're seeing as effective in churches right now is smaller groups are growing. They're helping people engage relationally. And really, I think a lot of discipleship happens in relationship. It just as much or maybe more than happens in a classroom, in a class setting, in a learning setting. So
yeah, that's right.
I think if your church hasn't yet gotten intentional about your relational engagement strategy, you may have a great strategy for how you're sharing information and teaching people. But if you haven't gotten really intentional about how you're helping them engage relationally with each other, I would challenge you to take that step and do that.
Yep, that's good.
Good. Okay, so we're actually hearing from a lot of pastors at larger churches that they're seeing significant cultural shift. It used to be that the way people started to engage was by serving first or grouping first. Now many churches are seeing giving happen before they volunteer or group, right? So
yeah, I've heard that before.
You're so smart, Amy. So it seems kind of shocking to me that almost 7 out of 10 churches had no idea how many first-time givers they had in the last year. Can you bring some perspective to that, Amy? Why is that a big deal to us?
Well, giving, I guess when we talk about this whole idea that people give before they serve, oftentimes now, it's obviously a clear step of engagement. Like, why wouldn't you want to track that?
Yeah.
And you need to, we always say this, what matters gets measured. There's a lot of indicators that it amazes me what churches don't track that's so easily trackable, and giving is an easy one to do. And if you've got people who are coming, but they aren't taking any step financially, it'll just give you an indication of their engagement level, right? Just like, are they in a group? Are they serving? It's all part of those same steps we want them to take.
Yeah.
Hey, Sean, of those that are tracking first-time givers, they said that there was a 43% increase in new givers. Why do you think that was?
Yeah. Well, I think this is kind of cool because I think it indicates that growing churches are actually having conversations about giving, and they're talking about money in their churches. I think it make the assumption that growing churches are attracting new people, and so they shy away maybe from those conversations. But that's not what this data says, I think. So a lot of churches they don't have an intentional strategy to really talk about these financial issues. And when they do, sometimes it's reactive. Sometimes it's really about, we've got a budget shortfall, or there's something that we need to support the church in. Really, these conversations are about personal discipleship. They're about helping people take a step in their own growth and their journey with Christ. And so I think being proactive about those conversations is really, really important. So if you're a church listening and you don't have strategically planned financial series sometime in the next year, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks, whatever it is, that in your church you're specifically taking some time to focus on personal finances, on how we steward our resources, because really they're God's resources loaned to us. Those kinds of concepts, I would hurry and get that on your calendar as quick as possible, because what we're seeing in the data is that growing churches are having those conversations. They're really, really critical.
Yeah. One other thing I'll just throw in, working with churches every week, I don't know why it surprises me, but I'm just proud of the churches. But a lot of churches, large, small, stuck, growing, have really moved away from passing a bag during the offering.
Yeah.
And instead, they're pointing people to, giving online. Some have giving kiosks, giving boxes. But what I'm finding is that they're able actually to talk about money in a more compelling, relevant way, because the bag isn't going to follow right after they talk about money, right? It's part of this value in this next step.
Yeah.
Christ follower.
Yeah, that's really good. And I mean, we're commonly seeing churches that have more than 50%, so more than half of their giving that comes in online through digital giving in one form or another. And one of the things that we do is we work with churches. We bring in some information about the number of online banking users in your community, in that 5-mile or 15-minute radius around your church. And many churches are just surprised that there are so many people who are engaged using online banking. And we could assume that if they're doing that, they would be more apt to give to your church in a digital form rather than drop a check or even cash in a bag that comes around.
Yeah, I just think it's a fear factor to take it away, because it's always been there. Yeah. But culture has, they've flown by the church in that regard, how they handle the money.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Well, we're going to jump into some Q&A. If you have any questions about anything, please post them in the chat. We'd love to address those. But first, if you're hearing all of this and you're thinking you could use some more help, just a suggestion for you. If you're looking through this data and wondering how your church compares and where the areas of health and unhealth are in your metrics, the churches that we're working with, they get a full vital signs report. So we take a couple of different data points. We get information from you, and we're able to provide context to you on what numbers are healthy, what numbers are unhealthy, and that helps you align your strategy in order to address challenge points or optimize areas where you're really strong. So if you're interested in learning more about that, we're going to send out a post-webinar email. My calendar link is going to be in there, and I would be happy if you'd like to just book 15 or 30 minutes on my calendar. We could get on a call just like this, and I could talk you through what that would look like to get some of those numbers and metrics and context for those into your hands as a church. So let me look and see if we've got any questions here before we wrap up. All right. I think we do. Just one comment. Somebody wants to send their metric sheet our way and have us evaluate it. I'd be happy to do that. If you want to, you can schedule a call with me, or you just email me, Sean@theunstuckgroup.com. I'd be happy to look at that. It'd be great. Any other questions out there? Anybody have a questions before we wrap up? S-E-A-N. S-E-A-N. That's a good question, Adam. Good job. There, Tiffany posted it for you. Any other questions before we wrap up? We will send out a post-webinar email with lots of information. I see the little recording button up at the top here, and so we're recording this, so the video will come out afterwards. So even for those of you who are watching the video at a different time, if you'd like to schedule something to just kind of chat through your numbers, if you have questions about the data in the report, if you want me to look at your metrics and give you some feedback on that, be happy to do that. So feel free to engage in that if you're, no matter when you're watching this.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Amy, I don't see any other questions coming through, so we'll just wrap up our time. Thanks for joining me from wherever you are. It looks like a beautiful hotel. I'm here in a lobby because my power went out about an hour before the webinar started, so I hustled to get over here so that I didn't miss any of this. But thank you, and thank you guys for joining us today. We hope this helped, and we're just so grateful for your help in gathering the data for your input into the report. So thanks, guys. Have a great one.